Research.
Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Danny Ritchie again here at GR Research, and again today we are doing another upgrade. And as you can see by this speaker next to me here, we're doing another Klipsch upgrade. The reason I keep doing Klipsch upgrades, like I've said before, you guys keep sending me Klipsch speakers to upgrade, and this one needed an upgrade. This was the most challenging of all the Klipsch models that have showed up. This one was in the roughest shape, had the biggest problems. This one was a mess. This one is the type of speaker that if the engineers would have sent this to me to do the crossover work, I would have sent it back and said, fix the response problems with the drivers before you send it to me. The tweeter's response was rough. The Woofers' response was rough. They had a complex crossover on it to try and correct for a lot of that stuff. There was a lot of parts. There's a lot of cheesy parts, just like what we've seen in past videos. Some polyester film caps, electrolytic caps, iron core inductors, sandcast resistors, small gauge wiring on the inductors on multi-layer boards stacked up on top of each other on the binding post cup. It was a lot to try and correct these drivers, and it didn't correct them still. One of the biggest problems, the acoustic centers are just too far apart. You have a tweeter here, you have two woofers playing the same frequency range. Your acoustic center is the midpoint between the woofer to the tweeter, which is over a foot, maybe 14 inches. For these to blend in that fashion and not sound like individual drivers, it would have had to cross at about 800 hertz or something to make up that gap and not sound like different drivers. And so that had to be corrected. I went in and made it a 2.5 way so that the acoustic centers are just between this woofer and the tweeter, and that allowed for a little higher crossover point that helped everything a lot. That fixed those issues. But it was still challenging to do a 2.5 way design. It was still a mess. So let's start by taking a look at the measurements on just the drivers themselves. And I've got some printouts here so I can kind of go over it with you guys. And I'm going to slide over here a little bit, and I'm going to let our video editor throw these measurements up so you guys can follow along. First, let's look at the tweeter's response. Here it is in red. As you can see, it's not a linear response. We have a huge hump right here before it falls, right at 1K, and we have an even huger hump at about 2300 hertz that is just a massive peak. And the horn or waveguide is so large that it is really ramping up the output levels. In fact, it went to over 110 dB of output at 1 watt 1 meter at the peak area there. And then of course it falls drastically, and then the top of the tweeter's range is a huge amount of stored energy and ringing that's going on that just went on and on. I mean, that thing just kept ringing. So tweeter's response, a bit of a disaster. Then we have the upper woofer's response. You can see it here in green, and it is also pretty rough. There's multiple areas of resonance there and peaks at the top of the range where you've got a lot of breakup, a lot of ringing going on there. So that's going to need a lot of help. You got a drop right there at the bottom where it's going through some baffle step loss. And then the lower woofer, it's very similar. It's got a little bit of a double humped response or double humped peak right there between one at around 600 to 700 hertz and one around 950, and then it also had the peaks down below. So pretty rough response. Now I measured this thing several ways. First I measured it at 1 watt 1 meter, and as you can see it here in red, you'll notice it's a pretty rough response, and there's a pretty significant dip right at around 1K hertz. It's falling like a stump right there. And the reason I measure at 1 watt 1 meter is that's an industry standard. You want to measure 1 watt 1 meter to see what the actual sensitivity is. And then, as you can also see here, let me throw up this one. This is the crossover response. As you can see, at 1 meter and on tweeter axis, the drivers do not sum well at all. They're not in phase. They're about 90 degrees out of phase. So you see the Woofers response, and you see a peak in the bottom or at the top of the Woofers response that wasn't controlled by the crossover. You see that hump come back up. But you see where they sum, they're in red. It didn't gain any output, and it's not out of phase. So it's about 90 degrees out of phase. Now the next thing I did was to move further away, and as you move further away, what you're doing essentially is you're allowing the woofers to be closer to the microphone than the tweeter, whereas on tweeter axis the tweeter is a little closer to the microphone than the woofers. They're further away in time. So as you move further away, you're shifting the time arrival of the woofers a little bit forward and the tweeter a little bit back. And when I did that, I moved out to 54 inches, and the response looked a little bit better there. You can see at the crossover point, which is about 1200 hertz or so, you want to see those things sum, and you want to see 6 dB of gain there when they're in phase. We're about 4 dB of gain there, so we're still not completely in phase. I would say to position yourself in the room to where these are in phase, you'd have to sit on the floor or lay down on the floor so that your head is much lower, so that these woofers in time will be further forward than the tweeter, and the time arrival will start to arrive in phase. Obviously though, you don't want to listen to the speaker while you're laying on the floor or sitting down really low in order for it to sound correct. You want to be able to sit at a normal seating position, and not only do you want the time arrival to be in phase, but what you want is an average room response to look like the on-axis response. You want a smooth on-axis, you want a nice smooth average in-room response. So rooms are all different, so you can't just take a room response and say here's what the room response is. What you have to do is you have to look at the off-axis response of the speaker in the horizontal plane and in the vertical plane and see how those things average. If you see a lot of roughness in the off-axis, then you know that those sidewall reflections or your ceiling reflections is going to reflect that roughness. So you're going to have an uneven in-room response. So if we go back to the 1 watt 1 meter and start taking some measurements here, some more industry standard measurements, I know a lot of you guys are going to say, yeah, but it's not as good as it could be at 1 watt 1 meter. That's true, but it allows us to see the window. In other words, it allows me to see what's going on axis and above axis. So we'll do on axis tweeter measurements, and we'll start moving the microphone above axis, and what we're doing is we're getting a picture of what it's going to do in the room. We're looking at how does the sound come out of the speaker and how does it radiate, and is it even over a wide range, or is it only even over a narrow range? And in this case, it's really not even anywhere. And if you get down really low, like I said, sitting on the floor with your head on the floor, you may get to a point where they're in phase, but the overall in-room response is still jacked up. So we still have to do those 1 watt 1 meter measurements to see what it's doing. We want to see what it's doing on axis and off axis. So let's throw up first that horizontal off axis measurement, and you see there's still a big hole over at the crossover point where they're not summing. And as you start moving horizontally off axis, it's still a pretty rough response. It's still pretty jagged. Then looking at the vertical off axis response, you can see that as the microphone starts to move up, the response starts getting worse and worse. In other words, as the woofer in time starts getting further away from the tweeter, no longer is it a 90-degree phase rotation at the crossover point. Now it starts becoming 180-degree phase rotation. In other words, just a complete cancellation. There's less output there where they sum than the output of either of the drivers individually. So the reflection you're going to get off your ceiling is going to be a reflection of some of the low frequencies in the woofer range and some of the really high frequencies in the tweeter range. And in that range where they cross, there's a huge hole there. So that was a mess. Also, we look at the spectral decay. We see, again, a reflection of the uneven response. We see the whole top end of the tweeter ringing excessively, And so what I did was I shot them individually so that you could see the spectral decay of the woofers. And as you can see at the lower end of the woofers range, there's still some stored energy there, and the woofers tend to ring a little longer in time. And if you look at the tweeter frequency, the tweeter's spectral decay, you'll see it drops off pretty evenly, but at the top it's ringing like a bell. I mean, it's rough. It's a mess. So work was cut out for me on this one. So here's what I did. Let me drag over for you my little portable table here, the lift table. I'm going to reposition the camera just a little bit so you guys can see what's here. And we're going to go over what it took to fix these things and what it's all going to cost. And we're going to look at what the measurements were whenever I was through with the whole thing. So we've looked at where it was to begin with. Let's see where it ends up. Let me adjust this camera and pull it down a little bit so we can see this. Here's what we ended up with on this thing. Set this right up here. If you take a look at this, I don't know if you guys can see it very well. The top network is what was necessary to smooth out the response of the tweeter, which involves all of these parts right here for one speaker and all of these parts for the other speaker. We've got all the parts laid out here for the pair. So it needed a notch filter at the front of the network. It needed a notch filter in the middle of the network to try and pull down that humongous peak. It needed a third order filter, and then on top of that I added a very small inductor at the very top of the tweeter's response just to knock some of that top end down, just to get rid of a little bit of that stored energy. And then plus there is an L pad at the end, and all of that to straighten out the tweeter's response. Now the mid circuit, which this now became a mid, it's still a mid woofer. It's still a 2.5 way, so it's still going all the way to the bottom, but it's the only one crossing to the tweeter. It was not that bad. It was this crossover right here and this crossover right here for each speaker. It's a third order filter basically, and it was a somewhat steep filter. As you can see, it's the one in the middle there, and that's what it took to get it under control. Now the tricky part is whenever you do a 2.5 way, typically you can just do a large inductor on the lower woofer and just use a first order filter, and you can knock it down so much that it blends well with the other woofer. In other words, we're just letting it play low frequency only. The problem was this woofer has so much breakup at the top end of its range that even with a 12 millihenry inductor on it, the breakup up at the top is still so significant that it's affecting the response of the two as a whole. So it needed a much higher order filter, even though it's playing only the lowest frequency ranges. But you can't put a higher order filter on those things because you start shifting phase when you do that. You start shifting the time delay of the signal reaching the woofer. So what you don't want to do is you don't want one woofer moving out while the other is on its way moving in. You don't want them fighting against each other. So you have to keep the phase of the crossovers the same in order for them to work together because they're sharing the same airspace. So any additional filtering that has to be done to knock that breakup out of it has to be done in the form of a notch filter or something in the form that doesn't shift the time delay between the two woofers because they have to stay in time. So what happened was it wound up not only needing a big 12 millihenry inductor, but it needed a notch filter, and then it needed a second notch filter that was just an inductor and a small cap to knock down the second peak. So it needed a lot to correct what's going on. So this is the filter for one, this is the filter for the other. So if you just look at this side, you see the crossover you're going to have to assemble to mount in this thing in order to correct it and to give it an accurate frequency response. So when you put these things together, you're probably going to need to put them on separate boards and mount them where you can reach them anywhere in these areas. There's a lot of space on the back panel. There's space on the sides, so you can just screw that to it and run the wiring down to the bottom to the input. And that's how you're going to have to go about installing it. Let's take a look at how this thing ended up. If we look at the on-axis frequency response, and here's a measurement showing one with the tweeter curve, and you can see it's a flat response and it drops rather quickly. And did the same thing on the woofer. It's rolling into this one, and there you see the measurement of just that one, and then the blue line you see at the very bottom is the low frequency driver only. The red line is how they sum, and as you can see, I was able to get a ruler flat response out of this thing. I mean, flat response, probably as smooth as anything that comes through here. It was just fortunate, really, that I was able to do that, but unfortunately, it took a lot of parts to do it. I mean, again, I would tell Klipsch, if they sent this speaker to me to design a network, go back and fix the response problems of the drivers, and then it doesn't take this amount of parts, this number of parts to correct it. That's why a lot of our drivers, when I design them, I work on those and try to get a natural smooth roll-off, like in our XLS Encore and many other kits that we offer. You'll notice there's just 2 parts in the network, and 2 parts is all it takes to get that woofer to create a nice, perfectly smooth roll-off. Same thing with our tweeters. When you got a tweeter and the response is all jacked up and it's all over the place, this is what you wind up with. This is what it takes to fix it. So, on-axis frequency response, again, really smooth. And as you look at the horizontal off-axis response, so you're going, you're on the tweeter axis and you're moving further away. And I did, by the way, design all this at 54 inches, which is a little further away, not just 1 meter. You have to move into 1 meter to kind of see what it's doing, what its factory rated SPL curves are and all that. But to design a crossover, you want to get a little further away when you're doing a big speaker and the acoustic centers are farther apart. So this was designed a little further away. So the sensitivities that you see on here may be a lot lower than what the actual speaker sensitivity is. It probably falls in somewhere around 92 dB when I was through with this thing, and the way it was from the factory, it was a little above 95. I'd say about a 95 average. So it's a little lower in sensitivity. I brought the levels down by making it a 2.5 way, but I made it more accurate, I made it smooth, and it's a little bit easier load to drive as well. Okay, horizontal off-axis again. It's dropping off really smoothly. It's keeping a pretty consistent response, left or right. Vertical off-axis. This is where a huge amount of improvement came about. This is moving the microphone up 4 inches at a time, and we're seeing very little drop in the off-axis. I mean, right at about 11 or 1200 hertz, we're starting to see a little bit of dropout only when the microphone's already 16 inches up in the air over tweeter axis. So now we're keeping a relatively flat response over a wide coverage range so that the overall room response is going to be a lot more balanced. And the impedance curve looks, it looks reasonable. I don't know if I had the impedance curve of the old one thrown up or I didn't mention it before. We can look at those two together. The impedance of the older curve is a little higher in the top end. Now that I'm done with it, it's a little more balanced. There's not so much of a huge impedance rise. And the Spectral Decay is a lot cleaner. There's still a lot of ringing up there at the tweeters range. At the top of the tweeters range. A lot of that's going to be some of what's going on right here in the throat. And the only way to really go about fixing that is to start going in there with little bitty strips of felt or foam and little pieces and start laying them in the horn, trying to figure out where that's coming from and how to put just the right amount in there to fix it. You'd have to have a microphone in front of it and a half a day's worth of work playing with different pieces and stuff, trying to fix that thing, or a loose amount of some type of polyfill or cotton put in front of the tweeter diaphragm, and you'd have to take it completely apart for that. So there's a lot of options there. I didn't try to go off in that direction because that's creating an inconsistency that you wouldn't be able to replicate. So I left the tweeter as is, just added that little inductor across the top to try and pull some of that high frequency out of it and to smooth the whole thing up. So this is where it ended up. And you can now fix this speaker. If you want to do the upgrade on this thing, it does involve a lot of parts. You're going to get all of these parts. You're going to get a full set of tube connectors that's going to replace those cheesy bonding posts. You're going to get 70 feet of wire in order to rewire this whole thing, and that's what it's going to take for the pair. This is individual copper runs. It's not dual runs like you think of as a speaker cable. So 70 feet. It's high purity copper, 4/9 pure copper, solid core in polyethylene, really high end wire. It's going to come with 4 sheets of no-res. You're going to need 4 sheets of no-res to line this thing and do away with all the cabinet resonances. And it's, especially on this back panel, oh, that's awful. It's pretty resonant. So the 4 sheets of no-res will tighten up the bass response, do away with all those resonances. With everything you're going to get in the kit, you're going to get the schematic, you're going to get all of our assistance and help and support. That all comes to $699. Now for $699, it turns this speaker into a pretty decent speaker. The way it is now, I don't know how you guys can listen to it. Pretty rough response. There's definitely ringing and breakup going on there. There's time arrival issues. There's a lot going on that all of this fixes. So for you guys that you want to upgrade these things, you want to fix them, you want to take them to the highest level you can, this is everything you're going to need to do it. I priced this stuff out using fairly budget level parts. It's still all the Earthsea Aircore XQ inductors except for this huge one that has to go on the lower woofer. Like I said, all Aircore. The caps are all Earthsea poly caps except for the 2 caps that are directly in line with the tweeter and the tweeter circuit. I use Sonic caps for those to give you guys some added clarity and detail levels that will be greatly appreciated, I'm sure. So good quality parts, not crazy super expensive parts, just solid, good quality, not expensive parts throughout. Use the link resistors, not the Mills resistors. The link resistors are about $1 a piece. Mills resistors are $7.50 a piece, so that would add probably another 60 bucks to the price of this thing or more. Actually more than that. There's a lot of resistors involved in this network. So link resistors, and throwing this out there for you to try and keep it at a reasonable price point. I know that's still added up to a lot, but that's what happens when you have to go to this extreme to fix something. This stuff really adds up. So if you guys have any questions, throw them in the comments section. If you got more Klipsch speakers for me to upgrade, send it over. Hopefully the other models will be a little better than this one. I think this is a little bit older model than the other ones I've been doing. Maybe that explains why they got away from this tweeter and went to the newer one, which some of the measurements I took of their newer model with the little rubber section around the inside measured quite smoothly. A lot smoother than this one. So you may be safer sticking to some of the newer models, but then again, we saw some of the same issues that we saw in this one and some of the newer models too. So if you guys you're in love with these things and you want to take them to another level, you want to fix them, send it in. I'll do what I can. And that's it for this week, and have a good one.